Then we have the ground ivy again, which I showed you on an earlier video. Again with these lovely little blue flowers. And in this moister part, where the field runs down the hill, we've got the bulbous buttercup. It's a much taller plant than the meadow buttercup. And they still have this wonderful yellow flower and masses of stamens in the middle. That shiny buttercup flower you get. Stick it under children's chins and to see if they like butter. As the yellow is reflected on their skin. Buttercups aren't very tasty, cattle don't like them, and although they look pretty in meadows, they're not very good as... and this funny little spiky thing is the fruit of the buttercup. This is a very common plant, not just in old pastures but grassland generally, and this is quite a small version of it. It's called plantains. It's one of a number of plantains which you get. This is the most common of them. Lamb's tongue or rib-leaved plantain, from the shape of the leaves. The flower head on the top here is a little simple brown thing, but it is in fact not just one flower but several flowers, and it has a pollination mechanism which prevents it for the most part from pollinating itself, which it don't want. It produces female parts. The bottom flowers produce their female parts first, and once it's pollinated, the female parts on the flowers further up appear, and those that have been pollinated, the male stamens, which you can see there, the yellow male stamens, they appear, and they gradually, as the pollination of the flowers takes place, you get male stamens appearing further and further towards the top. So this one is about halfway through the pollination of the flowers. The bottom ones have been pollinated, the ones at the top are still waiting to be pollinated. And they're wind pollinated, you can tell that because the stamens hang out in the wind. In insect pollinated flowers, the stamens tend to be inside a colourful flower, a flower with colour which is designed to attract insects, whereas this thing's not fussed about insects. It just wants a decent breezy day for its pollen to blow away in the wind. And of course those of you who suffer from hay fever will know that many plants, particularly trees, are wind pollinated. And at this time of year there's lots of pollen in the air, which can be very uncomfortable. And here is a bigger version of the rib-leaved plantain, and it has on it a beetle of some description. It looks like some kind of what they call a blister beetle. And there you can see how this plantain is almost fully pollinated. The stamens on the male parts of the flower, which come after the female parts, they start at the bottom and they gradually move up, and when the stamens here get to the top, all the flowers on here, and there are many of them, have been pollinated by the wind. And here, lower down the field, we have a completely different plantain. With a much longer flower head. But the same. This is the hoary plantain, very similar to the ribleaf plantain, same family. And you can see this is the flower head. There are many flowers here, each with a female part sticking out, the stigma. It's wind pollinated, so when the pollen lands on the stigmas at the bottom and the pollen fertilizes the flower then produces the male stamens which hang out in the wind. And here you can see one where the stamens are just beginning to be produced at the bottom, showing that those flowers have been fertilized. And gradually the stigmas are produced by the flowers further and further up the plant. And here we have one where the stamens, you can see there, approaching halfway. And on this one, all these flowers here have been pollinated. These are awaiting pollination here on the top. And these are the male stamens dropping their pollen into the wind. And the reason for this, it is argued, is that if pollen drops off these stamens, the flowers below have already been pollinated, so they don't pollinate themselves. Whereas the stigmas here, which are awaiting pollen, they get pollen from which has been blown from other hoary plantains elsewhere. So they're cross-pollinated, so you get better seed and more vigorous stock. This little yellow flower is one of the medics. I think it's called black medic, or common medic. Very prolific in some parts, but fortunately not here, because it can dominate the pasture. This is the remains of the early purple orchids, which I showed you on an earlier video in another little valley in the Dales. But they're obviously past now and setting seed. There are many different grasses growing these pastures, or grass. This one, I think it's sweet vernal grass. It's the grass which gives hay the smell, that nice smell of newly mown hay is produced by this grass, sweet vernal grass. This is another little orchid, the common tway blade. It's very plain, just has the two leaves and the typical orchid flower, which you can see there. There are only a few in the pasture and they all tend to be in one place. And not to be outdone, there's a common or garden daisy. But unusually, there aren't very many in this field at all. Where is it? Yeah, the big daisy is an ox-eye daisy. Usually you get a great mass of them, but in this field you just got the one. I can't see another one anywhere. I can hear a partridge somewhere. Wind is still blowing. The wind is still blowing very strongly. But here we have a little patch of thyme, which I haven't seen. And these little pink flowers. And there are more to come. You can see the sort of flower buds there which haven't quite opened. And take a little bit, rub it in your fingers. Smell it? It smells of thyme, that herb you get from the Mediterranean. You should get on pizzas and other foods. Oh. And this little plant, this little flower is a rough hawkbit. You can see how hairy it is. It has this hairy stem. This hawkbit is quite smooth compared with the other one. It doesn't have that hairy sepals underneath the petals there. It feels altogether a much smoother plant. And the other thing is that the flower, you tend to get branching flower stems on them, flower stalks, which the other ones don't seem to have. Here are two more orchids. They look very similar to the one at the bottom. They're a bit darker, but they don't have spotted leaves. The leaves, if you notice there, don't have any spots on them. What a lovely flower spike that is, with those beautiful orchid flowers on them. And here on the edge of the field we've got some lady's mantle. Again, that lime green coloured flower. Again, it's not a particularly good specimen, it's far too dry. It's a plant which prefers more moist conditions, and in the more moist Dales meadows you get an awful lot of it. It's a very pretty thing. There you can see the main leaf of the plant. Orchids have an odd pollination mechanism. In normal flowers, when a bee or an insect goes into flower, it comes out covered in pollen from the stamens. But orchids have these detachable stamens. They're called pollinia. And when the insect or bee goes into the flower, these things become detached and stuck to the top of its head. You can see them there on the end of the pencil. They're very small. So when the insect flies to another flower, the pollinia carry all the pollen with them. And the pollen is deposited on the stigma of the new flower, and of course once they've been in several orchids, they're festooned with these things with a little sticky patch on the bottom. And they produce. It's not the sort of thing you want to be doing to lots of orchid flowers, otherwise we wouldn't have any left. But orchids produce thousands and thousands and thousands of tiny seeds, almost like dust, very little of which germinates. But there it is, these little pollinia, very, very interesting. Blown around in this wind. But this is one of the last of the old Dales meadows, and it's very, very rich flora. I don't know how many flowers we've seen on this meadow, but it was how all meadows used to be before the days of fertilizers and fancy grasses, and we're left with this tremendous variety of flowers. In 20-30 years time there may be none left. Every year there are fewer and fewer of them. But they're a pure delight.